Sample Tank 4 has a lot of really nice built-in functionality to allow you to use real-time hardware control over different parameters on the instruments. So if you have a keyboard with knobs and sliders, you can use them to control various parameters. And I want to start in this video by looking at the macro panel over here and MIDI CC assignments. So each instrument loads in with 8 macro controls that can control one or more parameters. And in this case, I have an analog lead sound here. I'm going to switch to the edit window, and we can see here this is cutoff. And as I move the cutoff, it's going to sweep the filter cutoff frequency. Now let's say I want to control that with one of the knobs on my controller. We can right-click on the macro and look at the MIDI assignments and see what the defaults are. And this, with the factory assignments, it's defaulting to using CC12 for this first macro and then sequentially upwards for the 8 macros. But my knob outputs CC25, and I have a big on-screen fader here representing the movement of that knob. So when I move the knob, you can see it move there. So I want that to control macro 1. Well, I'm going to close this, and I'm going to right-click, and I'm going to go to MIDI Learn. And now I just need to move that knob, and it's reassigned. So now as I move it, you'll see it's moving this cutoff and the one that it's assigned to, which is the frequency cutoff in the filter. All right, so that works great, but let's say I want to limit the range, because I find when I get lower than about 10 o'clock or 9 o'clock, it's kind of too dark, and higher than there, it's kind of too bright. And I want to be able to use my knob freely, but limit the minimum and maximum range that it's going to go to. I'm going to right-click and go back to MIDI assignments here, and I can set a minimum and maximum value. So maybe I'm going to go to about 30% for the minimum, and maybe about 75% for the maximum. And we can have latch on or off, and that's great if you're using a button for a toggle type control to just turn something on or off, but in this case, it's not particularly relevant. So now I'll do that same thing, and as I move my knob, you'll see it won't exceed those boundaries. So that works great. I can go ahead and record that MIDI CC data in my DAW and live happily ever after. Or if I'm live on a gig, I can move my knob on the gig and I'm done. But let's say I want to customize this macro and I want to also have it control maybe the amp envelope for the filter. I want to have it control the attack. I'm going to right click here. And if I look at MIDI assignments, we'll see that we have all the macros here, but nothing else. There's my custom assignment. I'm going to hit close. And I'm going to right click here and go to the MIDI Learn. And I'm going to move that same knob. So now when I right click here and go to MIDI assignments, we're going to see a new entry for the element for that zone. I have CC25 also controlling that parameter with its own minimum and maximum range. Let's see what it sounds like. Okay, so I definitely need to really shrink the range here dramatically. So let's scroll down and I'll set the minimum to maybe about 20%. I don't want too wide a range, maybe about 45%. And I think I'm going to go and raise that minimum just so it doesn't get too dark. Let's try that and see what that's like. So you get the idea. You can control multiple parameters with different ranges in each one. Let's look at a different scenario. Now I've loaded in a fresh instance of this same patch, and I've assigned this to a different slider on my setup, the one next to it, which is CC26. Now, in the macros, let's say this last knob, LFO1 rate, it's not really doing anything. It's adjusting the rate here, but this isn't assigned to anything. It's not being used. I want to have this control some effects parameters. So I can click the on-off buttons for each of the effects in the effects rack here, and I can click on it to call it up. It's kind of a shortcut to hitting this button. But either way, I want to get here, and I want to adjust these parameters. So I want to adjust resonance and cutoff with this. So I'm going to use my MIDI Learn functions. And I'm going to move the knob on my keyboard, CC26. So now that's assigned there. And I'm going to do the same thing here. MIDI learn, move the knob. Now it's controlling both of them. And same thing here. So now it's controlling all three of them. And let's customize the ranges a little bit. We'll go to the MIDI assignments and we'll see in this fresh instance at the bottom the two different amounts. So for cutoff, let's go from maybe 35 to about 85. And then for resonance, maybe 50 with the higher end till about 90. And we can now control it with this knob or with the physical control on my controller. So that works great. And now maybe I want to rename this one. I'm going to right click here and go and rename, and I'll name it something that's meaningful to me. And of course I can put a description in here as well, but I'll leave that for the moment. And there's the name that I've reassigned. Now another way that we can get to doing this type of thing in the effects rack is hitting this mods button, and then we can add modulation routings for any of the effects in here. So I can go add modulation, and then I can manage the modulation from these controls here. So for example, now I have one modulation routing set up, and I'm going to have the source be macro 8. So I'm trying to recreate what I did here the old-fashioned way. And I'm going to have it modulate cutoff. And I'm going to add another modulation routing. And same thing, I'll have it go to macro 8. And this time have it control resonance. And we can control the different amounts uniquely for each of the routings. And we can add or remove routings like that and then have it controlled the same way. So just another way of skinning the same cat. I'll see you for more in the next video.